You are listening to Talking Star Wars.
Hello, Star Wars fans. I am Alex,
And I'm Connor.
and today we are going to talk about Star Wars.
Like we do from time to time, but I think this subject is going to be a little meatier because it's one that Alex and I have two different viewpoints on, and it's a topic that doesn't really have any clear definition in the Star Wars universe.
So, as you can tell from the title of today's episode, we are going to engage with the concept of the Gray Jedi. For those who are unaware, a Gray Jedi, in sort of the Star Wars fan conception community, is an individual who has the cool force powers from the light side and the cool force powers from the dark side, and in a video game fashion could like fry someone with force lightning, but then also heal someone, and is able to walk the path between dark and light. I inherently think this is somewhat of an edgy concept where actions have consequences and like equal balance between light and dark is actually not a good thing. But we're going to look at some examples in the Star Wars universe and how sort of the morality and power of the Force is constructed, and sort of engage with this idea of the Gray Jedi. Because Connor, what's your take on these fan concept of the Gray Jedi?
Yeah, I don't view it as the sort of Jedi Knight 2 or Star Wars Force Unleashed where it's someone who is so cool they can wield both. But I do enjoy this idea of finding a balance between light and dark, where we've talked about the fall of the Jedi, and it's not because they were so effective that they fell. It's that the Jedi had shortcomings. The dark side is evil, and the dark side is something that is corruptive, but trying to search for some balance between the two so that there's this conception of neutrality is interesting. People always ask, is Luke Skywalker a Gray Jedi? Is Qui-Gon Jinn a Gray Jedi? And we'll get into that today, but I think what we were talking about before this, the only person who presents themselves as being a true neutral in the Force is really the Bendu.
Yes, as Connor said, this idea of balance, I think he and I have different concepts of it. I agree that the dark side is inherently corrosive, so I do not think it can be safely used. We do see some people who do use the dark side of the Force and don't become a Palpatine or a Vader, but they're usually in the process of changing, and it's like riding a tiger that will eventually turn on them. It's like someone who says, "Oh, I can handle my heroin. I can just do a little bit of meth." Is my conception of it. But and I think this is sort of encaptured, as Connor said, by the only character who probably actively portrays themselves as a neutral being who stands between the light and dark side of the Force, except maybe the Father, who we'll get to, but the Bendu. He appears in Star Wars Rebels seasons 3 and 4.
And he's a big thing. He's a kaiju monster creature with a pretty human
I
face.
would say kaiju size. He's like
Mid
10,
kaiju,
15 feet tall, so like a giant ox like being.
so dai kaiju, not straight up kaiju.
Yeah. So the Bendu describes himself as the Bendu. It's like his title, and he's the
Mhm.
one who stands in the middle. And my thought on the Bendu is he's sort of this he's a rumination on the idea that with wisdom comes inherent moral superiority, which is an idea that's been kicking around in the human consciousness since, Arab philosophers and Greek philosophical times. It's like, wisdom is the highest virtue. And the Bendu is necessarily and depicted as being very wise. So and helpful to our protagonists. Despite not being a Jedi or devoted to the light side of the Force, the Bendu assist Kanan Jarrus in learning how to see using the Force after he is blinded. He is able to equally utilize both a Jedi and Sith holocron without issue, which
Mhm.
allows him to uh,
He kind
further
of
his
combines them. They're yeah, right.
with a rather shocking display of power. But what is our? But he is also he puts our protagonists in dangerous situations without their consent, as a teaching tool. But unlike a Jedi teaching where there would be a Jedi Master there to save the students if they failed, if in the Bendu's view, if Ezra Bridger or Kanan Jarrus could not handle his teachings and they died, well, then that was the will of the Force.
If I remember right, they Kanan and Ezra commanded him to help them combat Thrawn, and so with a bit of anger, which is not a Jedi trait, Bendu said, okay. And he threatened both the Empire and the Rebellion and kind of wiped out both forces in equal
Yeah,
parts.
so it's the end of the Bendu's arc that we see.
Yeah.
And so we have one faction who takes time from their evacuation of being attacked by a fascist military regime to go alert this powerful neutral figure. Hey, the Empire is here. You have to evacuate. And maybe could you help us survive? And the Bendu is offended by the act that he might take action in
Mm-hmm.
this way. And even when he is shamed and challenged, and he reacts emotionally, not Jedi-like at all. There's the veneer of serenity falls away from the Bendu, and he grows quite violent and quite confrontational. And then in the ensuing battle, um, he attacks both forces, including the people who are trying to kill him, such as Thrawn's forces, and the
Mm-hmm.
people trying to save him, but had just called out his bullshit, which were uh, the rebellion forces. And whereas Kanan Jarrus and Ezra Bridger were trying to be like, "Hey Bendu, escape with us," Thrawn finds him and immediately attempts to kill him because he aided the rebellion's escape, allowing a fragment of Phoenix Squadron to escape.
Mm-hmm.
The Bendu then vanishes as if he becomes one with the Force, or perhaps is able to transport himself away, laughing. He foreshadows Thrawn's eventual fate, because the Bendu is very powerful in the Force. So I know we have other figures we want to get to, but
Mm-hmm.
what do we think of the Bendu's proclamation of neutrality and the actions that he engages in?
I mean, he imparts wisdom, he imparts teaching, he imparts healing, just as far as allowing Kanan to develop himself. He's not gifting these people with favors, he's teaching them to sort of find their own inner strength. And then, when called to action, he takes action, but he just takes it against all parties in a way that is very neutral because both have suffer. Um, so, I mean, on paper, it is this very neutral way of teaching lessons. Kanan and Ezra still survive the maelstrom that is the Bendu. Is Thrawn better off? I don't think so, because he's going to eventually fail in his intentions.
Yeah, so I think the Bendu, while being very wise, has this sense that his way is the morally superior one,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't necessarily think that that is true.
I don't think it is either.
I think that his conception is then challenged by actual events, and the only way he could maintain true neutrality is by isolation.
Mm-hmm.
When the world, with all its complexities, intrudes on his domain, he is forced to decide in a messy, fragmented situation, and he chooses the self interested one. I attack everyone who's not me, my way is superior. I'm going to spout out some one liners, use some lightning to fry both my friends and my enemies, and then take the moral superior stance that I was right all along.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, I wouldn't call it infantile, but it is a failure of the Bendu's philosophy to being able to grapple with the complex realities of politics and
Mm-hmm.
war. He attempts to portray himself as above such things, but when his personal safety and pride are threatened, he boils over into the dark side and kills a bunch of people. And in some ways, he's almost portrayed as a force of nature. But he is a thinking, reasoning being who engaged in these choices.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we're intended to forgive the Bendu for blasting some rebel transports out of the sky in a fit of pique.
Right.
So
And that's kind of what a gray individual should be. It's not someone who is in the right. Uh, if we take a look at, Luke Skywalker and his Rashomon style story with Ben Solo, each of these characters have their own motivations that they view as being correct, and it's not the same from another point of view. So
but
I don't think that any my conception of gray isn't supposed to be like, oh, you have reached total balance, you've reached ultimate level, therefore everything is great. I think it's just a different point of view.
yeah, I think
Um,
someone who's in sort of in this gray space is inherently one of struggle or attempting to change. The
mhm.
Bendu is one of the figures who is resisting changing and wanting to be exactly as he is, and this makes him inflexible. And while wise, is not good or
Mhm.
virtuous.
And that's what we talked about the fall of the Jedi. Just that inflexibility is one of the causes. But you bring up the figure of the father, and that might be a good
Yeah,
natural stepping point, just because we're still in the realm of animation. But uh, the father is this extra galactic being who represents the Force. and he has a son who represents the dark side and a daughter who represents the light side. While he is the balance, he is the whole.
Yeah, and it's ambiguous whether he's an actual being that
Mm-hmm.
has this mantle, whether he's a anthropomorphic personification of the Force, whether he is a twisted effects of Anakin Skywalker's mind as the chosen one. It's all relatively vague, though that latter would be a bit of a stretch. We see like artistic depictions going
Mm-hmm.
back tens of thousands of years. So
Yeah.
um, on in multiple galaxies at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So the figure of the father as sort of this balance point is an interesting one because it does portray as like, oh, the living force or the cosmic force. We'll call it the living force because it has
Mm-hmm.
agency. The cosmic force is sort of just the background
Yeah.
power. So of the living force, that's the father,
Mm-hmm.
and then he's got. And again, I think this shows he acknowledges that his son is the darkness, and that's just an inherent part of what the force is.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you have living thinking beings, they have dark intentions at some point.
Mm-hmm.
And he is attempting to keep the darkness under control, but I'm not sure about his relationship with his daughter, who's 100% devoted to her father.
Mm-hmm.
So why he feels like he needs to keep the peace between them. So I think this is an area right for study. Do we think the father is correct in trying to keep both of his children under control? Or is that just a control? Is it because he's acknowledging that light and
Mm-hmm.
dark need to exist? And that if light, by forcing confrontation, could just make the darkness grow stronger? Or is this a fallacy? And is the father just needing to acknowledge that his son, the dark side, is unsavable? And if he had taken action sooner, then darkness would not have triumphed.
Mm-hmm. I taking a look just because the nature of the father and his children in the Star Wars story is vague. It's intentionally vague. Uh, his children may not be literal, you know, spawn of his being, but the forces of the galaxy. In my view of the Force, in the view of life, in the view of just philosophy, there is inherent dark, and there is inherent light, and it's the balance is in when both are in opposition, uh, because neither can be fully erased. And while the world would be a better place if there was no darkness, if there was no evil, there's something in the nature of the I was going to say human, but in Star Wars, not everyone is human. In the matter of the living soul, there will be darkness there, and it's the job and role of a light side Jedi in order to maintain that balance, also within them and within the galaxy as a whole.
So, in this sense, I'm actually going to say that the father is not a gray figure. He is an acknowledgement of the complex forces that interplay in the galaxy,
Hmm.
that light and dark will always exist, but is not attempting to pass a moral judgment or portray either side as equal. He doesn't have to try to control his daughter, he has to try to control his son. His
Hmm.
daughter is there to help. So, in that sense, I think rather than being a gray force, we don't see the father use lightning or try to murder anyone, so I don't think the father uses both the light side and the dark side. He is simply acknowledging that the dark side exists and attempting to mitigate the damage that it causes.
Hmm.
And you could be an argument made that he also attempts to control his daughter because if the light side is taken too far, it attempts to eradicate the dark entirely without just acknowledging that it will exist. And to the daughter's attempt to permanently kill her brother, that
Hmm.
then actually results in the death of the father.
And that's where the state of the galaxy is, where the Jedi have tried to eradicate the Sith, where they have tried to not try to understand from, not try to rehabilitate, but wipe them out, get rid of them, which
Yeah,
is
pretend the darkness doesn't
yeah,
exist. So
it's an extremist view. And then what happens? Palpatine comes back, corrupts Anakin Skywalker, possibly creates Anakin Skywalker, depending on what stories you read into, and therefore wipes out the Jedi. It's when both sides again are existing in opposition, they can kind of keep eyes on the darkness and acknowledge it without neglecting that it exists.
all right. Well, I think in our episode about Gray Jedi, we should move
Yeah.
on to some actual Jedi to discuss and sort of how their
Mhm.
philosophy and actions line up with this conception of a Gray Jedi.
Yeah, we've already mentioned in some of our previous episodes that there's the notion of dark Jedi and the notion of a rogue Jedi. Baylan Skoll is a dark Jedi. He is someone who followed the Jedi Order and is now starting to kind of selfishly delve into his own machinations. But we also have Ahsoka, who is also not really following the tenets of what it means to be a Jedi, but she is still upholding the light side of the Force.
Yeah, so some of the Jedi we're going to discuss here, we'll circle back to Baylan Skoll and Ahsoka in a moment. So
Mhm.
Baylan Skoll, Ahsoka Tano, Qui-Gon Jinn, a way seeker from the High Republic period, Orla Jareni.
Mhm.
I'm going to throw Asajj Ventress in there. She did receive Jedi training.
Mhm. I would
And
say Luke, for sure, in one movie at least.
Count Dooku,
Mhm.
he eventually becomes a Sith, but he was not always. So look at him through the lens of his
Mhm.
time as a Jedi. So let's look at those Force users
Mhm.
and how they match up against this idea of the Dark Jedi. And I think Baylan Skoll is a good place to start, in that I think he's the closest that we see to someone who's sort of like the common fan conception of what a Dark Jedi is.
Mhm.
He's cultured, he's well spoken, he's philosophical. He uses both the light and dark side of the Force, in that he has precognition and foresight very powerfully, but also Force chokes people and murders people. And so
Mhm.
he is trying to walk both paths, but he is on a to copy a phrase from Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman, vaguely sauntering downwards in a fall towards darkness. His actions are not sustainable, and if he once had this veneer of civility, when push comes to shove, he is a violent murderer. Whatever his philosophical underpinnings, he is a murder. He is a murderous mercenary working for a warlord.
Yeah.
However he portrays himself.
He's motivated very personally, very selfishly. He wants to access this other galaxy so that he can uncover the secrets of the Force. This isn't coming from any sort of humanitarian effort. This is all coming from his personal search for enlightenment and power. So uh, Count Dooku is very much the same way, where he's on that slippery slope where uh, he's not going to follow the Jedi Order anymore. He's going to follow his own personal path, and that led him straight into becoming a Darth.
Yeah, so if you have read and or listened to the audio drama Dooku Jedi Lost, we know that Dooku was a Jedi Master and a successful one for decades. Trained Padawans, was well respected, but then had always kept secrets, had always had a predilection towards darkness. He had the inherent ability to project Force lightning, which he discovered at a young age and hid. So, and finally, when push comes to shove on his home planet and his brother is uh, pushed him into a corner and he's abandoned his duties to go confront his brother on their home planet of Sereno, he force lightnings him to death
Mm-hmm.
and leaves the Jedi Order and declares himself Count Sereno. Now, at this point, Count Dooku is not a Sith. He had not even been in the orbit of, well, Palpatine was probably aware of him,
Mm-hmm.
but he had not become Palpatine's apprentice. In fact, does not formally become Palpatine's apprentice until he kills Yaddle, as seen in Tales of the Jedi, and then earns his title of Darth Tyrannus, truly. But before that, he is, again, this concept of a like Gray Jedi. He's left the Order.
Mm-hmm.
He keeps his lightsaber. The Jedi still let him around. So, they could have portrayed him as like this cool outsider who still has great Force powers, but just has philosophical differences with the Jedi Order.
Mm-hmm.
But either the Jedi Order's and the Jedi Order lets him come around. They're like, "Hey, we want to chat with you. You were a valued member of the Council." Yoda still invites him to come take counsel. He's
Mm-hmm.
allowed to attend Qui-Gon Jinn's funeral, even after leaving the Order. But then he is seduced by Palpatine and becomes Darth Tyrannus. And that is a very swift downward trajectory from the noble but troubled man we see who feels he must become Count Sereno, despite hiding his ability to do Force lightning and command dangerous beasts, to instead be ordering the atrocities that we see even a decade later Count Dooku do as the Prime Minister of the Senate of, sorry, the Chancellor. What's his title in the Separatist Alliance? Yeah,
That's a good question.
I will call it
Supreme
just,
Leader?
yeah, secret autocrat with a technical democratic title that he doesn't deserve.
Yeah.
Just ordering atrocities and murders. So Dooku could have been viewed as a great Jedi, but he quickly becomes a Sith.
Yeah.
And so
And
I think
that's where
this,
Balin's going to be following as well. Even if it's not Sith in name, he's definitely in the dark as far as this dichotomy goes.
and I think this is supporting my belief that the dark side is not something one can safely dabble in. It
Mm-hmm.
is not like, oh, you can occasionally use the dark side at times of extreme duress, and it's a useful tool to be used,
Mhm.
at least not for a Jedi. We'll talk about some other
Yeah.
figures who are tempting to do that, and if that's
Mhm.
sustainable.
Without delving into the backstory of each of these characters, I want to point out three actions that I view something borderline Jedi committing that would be considered dark side adjacent. We've had an episode on the force manipulation, the force mind trick, Jedi mind trick. We have Qui-Gon Jinn attempt to use this against Watto in order to serve his own personal gain. We have Mace Windu, who is not willing to place Palpatine under a trial, but goes straight to murder
Well, I
Palpatine.
wouldn't call at that context. I wouldn't call it murder. I would
Execute.
execution would be the appropriate word. But I mean,
Execute.
yeah. What's
Uh-huh.
the summarily execute Palpatine without trial?
Right.
Yes.
And then we have Luke Skywalker, who by the point of Return of the Jedi is freely using the Jedi mind trick, force choking individuals uh, for the sake of arguably personal goal in order to reclaim his friend. But these are actions that, seen in a vacuum, would be viewed as being morally shady, gray. There are actions that are done, I would say, in all these cases except for that of Mace Windu's, done for selfish reasons, self-centered reasons, not exactly negative. The outcomes are for the best, but are there other ways to attain these same sort of feats without having to manipulate others? Because I think when we discussed the notion of force choke and the Jedi mind trick, that is exerting one's will over another, which typically, uh, unless your name's Obi-Wan Kenobi, would be frowned on in the Jedi Order. And Alex
Yeah.
will remind us what those episodes are.
So you can listen to episode 36 about the Force Choke and episode 41 about the Jedi Mind Trick. But moving on from that, so I agree that there are certain actions, but that could be inherently seen as dabbling in the dark side. By the modern period, the Jedi certainly don't see the mind trick as a dark side power,
Mm-hmm.
when depending on how it's used. There's a dark side version called Force Dominate, where you just uh, basically take control of someone's mind, and we see Palpatine and Vader both engage in this.
Mm-hmm.
But
Kylo Ren, to some extent, pulling memories from people's minds.
yeah, and in a time of war, we do see Anakin Skywalker, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Mace Windu trying to rip the location of some endangered children from the mind of Cad Bane.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Cad Bane is not a sympathetic figure whatsoever, but I think we were intended to find that scene as somewhat troubling
Mm-hmm.
and a sign of what the extremes the Jedi were forced to in a time of war that then does lead to their fall.
Yeah, I think that we have pillars of the Jedi like your Coyote-Mundis. I don't know why he was the first one to come to mind, but these Jedi who, like Plo Koon, would take a very moral high ground. Rescued the clones, they're people too. Um, but at the same time, we have Jedi who perform darker feats, and that's where it's this idea of the gray morality, where they're committing acts that are immoral for the greater good.
So this is a thing that I brought up. That you have Star Wars as a franchise and as a world. Where does gray morality go in? So we have Luke Skywalker, a Jedi in training, destroyed the Death Star, kills millions of people.
Mhm.
He does not really seem to feel guilty about that. It was a super weapon. It was a necessary action. He's lauded as a hero for it. And while some Imperials think that he's a mass murderer, he himself does not see himself like that. And we are never intended to see that Luke is at risk of falling to the dark side for engaging in legitimate military action against a dangerous military target.
We never get that story though of the security officer of detention cell 1138 who can't go home to his family now, and
Oh
now
no,
his family have no imperial credits being funded in.
no, I mean,
Yeah.
I think that is portrayed as a horrifying effect of war
Mm-hmm.
itself. Do we judge Luke Skywalker for destroying the Death Star before it blew up entire
Mm-hmm.
planets? Not really, nor personally do I think should we. I would blame more the Imperial war machine that made such actions necessary in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, you could have that be more morally ambiguous if the Death Star had not been used, but it already had been to
Mm-hmm.
blow up a planet of billions of people. So in this case, I think Luke's actions are 100% justified, and I do not think we really need to grapple with Luke's decision to blow it up. But you have
Yeah.
other figures, however, that engage in more questionable behavior because one, either they're not as heroic or they are forced into situations that Luke
Mhm.
Skywalker never finds himself in. Particularly figures that come to mind: Cassian Andor and Saw Gerrera. We'll bring up Asajj Ventress here in a moment too. So I think Cassian is a good example because he's a protagonist still, whereas Saw is
Mhm.
more of a antagonistic figure, kicked out of the Rebel Alliance. So Cassian Andor does gray things. The first thing we see him do in Andor is kill someone in cold blood to maintain his cover. The first thing we see him do in Rogue One is to kill someone in cold blood to maintain his cover. Um,
Right. We're not supposed to see him as a paragon of light. We're meant to see him as a morally ambiguous hero, a gray hero.
yes, but at the same time, we never question Cassian's commitment to the Rebel Alliance.
Mhm.
Is the actions he's taking the best ones for himself or the Rebel Alliance? You can argue that back and forth. But Cassian Andor is in no danger of falling to the dark side, becoming a Sith.
Mhm.
So does this mean that someone who is force sensitive, and this is what I'm going to argue, is has to be either more careful or more judicious in engaging in, I would call them murderous, questionable, dark side behaviors? Because if Cassian Andor guns someone down in an alley to maintain his cover, it's he bears that guilt, but there is no cosmic force in the universe that could corrupt him by doing so.
Mhm.
It's only his own guilt, his own psychology, his own personal mind and morals that are affected. But if Luke Skywalker is in a dark alley and pulls out his lightsaber, if Luke Skywalker strikes down his father in anger, is he then vulnerable to then falling and becoming a worse person than Cassian Andor would be? And I believe the Star Wars universe comes in on the side of yes, that when you are a force sensitive individual that has been engaging with the tenets of the Jedi and are vulnerable to the dark side, you do not get as much moral leeway
Mhm.
as someone who is not force sensitive, because you can literally be corrupted by a corrosive force of evil that can take over your actions, corrupt your soul, and lead you down a path to do horrible, horrible
Mhm.
things. I think it's why the Jedi Order existed for so long, is because it mitigated that threat. People with the ability to manipulate cosmic forces, as many settings have grappled with, may have fewer freedoms and life choices
Mhm.
because they are uniquely vulnerable to the darkness and you know temptations that such power
Mhm.
offers.
When I going back to Cassian Andor, he's someone who has the arc of starting as this point where okay, anyone's expendable if they uh, are going to threaten the safety of the rebellion. He has the order and option to take out Galen Erso, the creator of the Death Star, but he chooses not to. He chooses to. When we see Luke Skywalker choking Gamorrean guards and force manipulating the mind of Bib Fortuna, these are things that on paper are morally dark, but we know that Jabba the Hutt's not hiring, the up and up Gamorreans, they're the ones who are willing to work for Jabba the Hutt.
But,
We
but but
see
at the same time, we see in the book of Boba Fett that the Gamorreans largely didn't have many choices.
mhm.
So
What I'm trying to argue is that we don't see Luke's actions as being evil, even though on paper they are negative things. They're, choking someone is not a great thing. But this is in the same film where we see him visually grapple with this idea of taking his anger out and striking down his father, and he sets his lightsaber aside. So to me, Luke was always this ideal of grayness where he can complete the darker aspects, but he is still utterly for the sake of trying to redeem his father.
uh,
Um,
I would say that Luke has been grappling with the dark side the entirety of Return of the Jedi, and that is why he had a real potential of falling to the Emperor's hand. He was
mhm,
vulnerable. I say that Luke turning off his lightsaber and refusing to kill Vader as the Emperor wants is his acknowledgement that the actions that Luke Skywalker Jedi can take are more constrained than Luke Skywalker Hero of the Rebellion, who if he had not become a
mhm,
Jedi. So Luke Skywalker Hero of the Rebellion, who does not know that Darth Vader is his father, can shoot Darth Vader in the head in that situation and he would be justified in doing so. This is Vader. This is the fist of the Emperor.
Mhm.
Luke Skywalker Jedi can't do that. Well, I'd argue he probably could have if his mindset had been
Mhm.
different, because some people, the Jedi, have never shied away from the deaths of the violent to protect the
Mhm.
innocent being necessary. I mean, they all carry a deadly weapon around, um, but in that moment, he could not take that action without falling to the dark side, and he acknowledged that as Jedi Knight Luke Skywalker, his
Mhm.
actions were more constrained.
He also demonstrates the tenet of attachment, which is not a Jedi trait. It's a Sith trait. Anakin Skywalker is all about his attachment to Padme, and it's what led to his downfall.
I'm going to cut in there. I don't think attachment is inherently a Sith trait. I think that uncontrolled attachment is an easy vector by which many Jedi can become vulnerable to the dark side, because the attachment leads to other emotions such as possessiveness, jealousy, fear, greed, and so on. There's definitely an engagement with that idea in across the spectrum of
Mhm.
Jedi philosophy. And by the time we see the Jedi Order right before the Clone Wars and during the Clone Wars, they're pretty dogmatic about
Mhm.
attachments. But we see that the Jedi Order was not always so, had more nuance to it in the past, but that has fallen by the wayside as they've been forced to become a more monolithic organization.
Well, by the time that we see them in the prequel trilogy, it is all that Anakin can learn that attachment will lead to the dark side. Attachment will lead to vulnerability, darkness, and corruption. But Luke demonstrates that attachment is one of his greatest strengths. It's attachment that allows the rebellion to save Han Solo. It's his attachment to his father that allows him to redeem him and bring the Emperor down, because he arguably may not have been able to, where Vader could have. And if Luke was forced to strike the Emperor down, yes, he would have been as, would have become as powerful as the Emperor, would have fallen into the sway of the dark like the Emperor. It's this notion that, like, out of any character that I could point to, it's just where Luke is able to maintain these ideas that aren't Jedi ideals, but still enact for the greater good and the greater balance of the galaxy. That's where the success in someone who's more gray, someone who's more, I should say, someone who's less dogmatic than your typical Jedi would
Yeah.
be.
And I would say that other Jedi and their actions just, and we'll get back to our Gray Jedi in a moment, but going this idea of attachment, I don't think attachment is inherently a Gray Jedi trait. I think it was a tenet of the Jedi Order that was a preventative measure, but not
Mm-hmm.
always successful. Like, look at Kanan Jarrus. It was his bond and friendship with his group and his lover and his apprentice and his friends that allowed him to stop from falling to the dark side. Kanan Jarrus, we never see him, cowboy Jedi that he is never in risk of becoming a fallen dark Jedi.
Mm-hmm.
His apprentice Ezra Bridger is another matter. Be traumatized youth, but Kanan Jarrus, his attachments are what saves him.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, he is at a key moment able to let those attachments go and does not let them rule him. Not all
Mm-hmm.
Jedi are that, including his apprentice, are that powerful. We also see Cal Kestis from Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor. It is his bonds with his crew and his friends that hold him back from falling to the dark side, but also show him as being vulnerable to the dark side. So he is a more nuanced grappling with this. Is Cal would Cal fall into the dark side without his friends? Potentially. Are his friends being in danger, causing Cal to call more and more on the dark side? Yes. Whether that's sustainable, we'll have to wait till the third game comes out.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I want to use Cal as our segue back into the Gray Jedi topic. But any final thoughts on the attachment piece, Connor?
That's just where I see Luke. At, that's where I support Luke as being a great Jedi, just because by and large, the if we look at the Jedi Order, taking a look at Cal and Kanan and Luke, these are all Boken Jedi who are brought up during the Dark Times, who don't have the strict Jedi rule. Uh, but it is arguably through this Jedi rule that Anakin became corrupted. Where if the Jedi had less strict policies on attachment and less strict policies as far as all in or not, as far as maintaining a role as a Jedi if you have attachments, we might not have gotten Darth Vader. Uh, so it strikes me as being, again, that more neutral, balanced approach is to accept your attachments, but don't let them overrule you. With the idea of Gray, it's never like equal parts good and bad. It's more of a recognition of what's bad and still doing good despite of it, and not just cut it out because it's bad.
Yeah. So, and I would say that is definitely a depiction of a healthier Force user. I would not portray Luke as a Gray Jedi in that. I would portray him just as a Jedi, a wise Jedi Master who has come to a new realization. He was Gray during the period in Return of the Jedi before he confronted the Emperor, and by refusing to kill Vader, and then by defeating the Emperor and establishing the new Jedi Order, he was, rather than being a Gray Jedi in my mind, was just a true Jedi Master who had acknowledged his darkness, moved past the Gray period, and this is what matches what I said earlier, that I think Gray Jedi are people in the process of changing, either for good or ill, grappling with the dark side and deciding how they end up. So that is my idea for Luke.
Yeah, and I agree, because by the time of the Book of Boba Fett, he is really leaning into that idea of the light side and leaning back into the rules of the Jedi and the attachment. And where do we see him by The Force Awakens? The Jedi Order has ended again because of these strict views. Bad is bad. Bad cannot be redeemed. It's like Mace Windu. We must execute the Chancellor. We cannot try to redeem him. Redeeming the Emperor is a fatalistic idea, but it's still worth a shot.
Yeah, so I think we have a couple other figures to touch on here for the Gray Jedi concept.
Yeah, we talked about Ahsoka a little bit, but even in our Spotlight episode on Ahsoka, she is a Jedi in all but name. She is still following the teachings, representing this beacon of light and peace. She's just not labeling herself as such.
Yeah, and I would not call someone who just rejects the tenets of the Jedi Order, but still engages in all the behavior of a Jedi, to be a Gray Jedi. She would have been called a way seeker back in the time of the High Republic. They call her a Ronin at the moment, but I mean, if it walks like a Jedi and talks like a Jedi and swings a lightsaber like a Jedi and saves the weak like a Jedi, I think we can call Ahsoka a Jedi.
Yes.
But other figures that are more gray, and I think going into a more transition period, we have two interesting figures, Qui-Gon Jinn and Asajj Ventress. So Asajj Ventress is probably our most complex Force user we can look at, because she was raised as a Night Sister of Dathomir, Force sensitive, was due to that reason kidnapped and sold into slavery, rescued by a Jedi Knight, who then made her his Padawan, recognizing her Force sensitivity, and then he was killed. She went on a rampage, falling to the dark side, to the degree that she was then recruited by Count Dooku as his Sith assassin, left that, fell in with a Jedi Master, and then worked as and before that also worked as like this bounty hunter. So I think if we're gonna look at her as like this Gray Jedi, there's two periods in her life that we need to look at: following the death of her master, her first one, and then when she's this independent bounty hunter. Because Asajj Ventress, as we can see in the novel The Dark Disciple, never stops feeling that she can call on the dark side when she needs to. She calls upon rituals of the Night Sisters of Dathomir. She even tries to teach Quinlan Vos how to call on the dark side without being overwhelmed by it, which is, I think, as we see in the figure of Mother Talzin, I think the Night Sisters think, oh, we can call on the dark side with no consequence, and I don't believe they're correct. I think they've ritualized the consequences to a point where they can channel the negative effects, but they can't avoid them. But so what do we think about Asajj as this dark Jedi? Because she's a figure in constant transition and change, which very much matches my conception of this dark Jedi, or this Gray Jedi, just being someone who's grappling with the dark side and has not yet landed in either having fallen to the darkness or managing to overcome it.
Well, I think after her master dies, she's on this dark Jedi trajectory rather than Gray, because
she murders so many people.
Yeah, and she's trying to seek out a position with Dooku as his right-hand assassin.
And before that, it was revenge. She
Yeah.
killed the people who killed her master.
By the time that she has been forced out by Palpatine and Dooku, she's a free agent, and free agents are bound to be thinking from a personal point of view. So kind of like the Bendu, she is acting out of self-interest.
But also survival, I think. She is in a like, the Jedi despise her. Dooku wants to kill her, so she needs to have her own independent power base. We don't see her pursuing more than survival. She's not trying to set herself up as a petty king or queen. She's not trying to become leader of a band of pirates. She's just attempting to survive.
I think it shows that it would be very difficult to have a Gray Jedi Order, because any one that we're pulling from are inherently self-interested, and they...
Or in a period of transition, trying
Yeah.
to find a permanent location. None of them, even Baylan Skoll has exactly one person in his orbit, and by the end of the first season of Ahsoka, he sends her away because their interests are no longer aligned.
So, yeah, it's there's really only one other example that I can think of, but I'll save it for a bit. But yeah, Asajj Ventress is very much self-interested, surviving. She is gray in that she isn't trying to eradicate a species or exert control over a planet. She will commit acts of atrocity as far as they satisfy her self-interests, but only so far as it will allow her to survive and thrive in a dark times.
Yeah. So she's not like as evil as someone like Cad Bane, for
Mhm.
example. But similarly, in her moral ambiguity, like someone like Boba Fett or Bosk.
Mhm.
But there's a unique danger to Asajj Ventress engaging in the kind of behavior that would be reprehensible but expected for Boba Fett.
Mhm.
If Asajj Ventress, Night's sister, Sith assassin, former Jedi Padawan, engages in it, she is at more risk of falling into much more dangerous patterns of behavior.
You brought up Qui-Gon before, and Qui-Gon's a very different example from Asajj Ventress, because Asajj has been everything. Qui-Gon is, and has been, always Jedi, but...
Yeah, a Jedi, a wise and respected Jedi master, but seen as a maverick. So
Mhm.
Qui-Gon is an interesting figure in that his actions take place entirely within the context of the Jedi Order.
There is some self-interest where it's not out of selfishness, but it's out of his perception of the Force. I will train the boy. I have a feeling about the boy, and it's good. Like, I need to train this boy no matter what the Jedi Order says, because I understand the Force better. He's self-interested, but he's using his argument of his understanding of the Force in order to justify that.
Yeah, and we see in supporting material that Qui-Gon Jinn has always butted heads with the Council and their vision of the Force. He was Dooku's apprentice. For a long time, he picked up Dooku's obsession with Jedi prophecy, and that has colored his outlook. But we never, despite the actions Qui-Gon engages in, which are often, he can be more extreme than other Jedi. Very quick to Jedi mind trick Boss Nass, to attempt to Jedi mind trick Watto.
Mhm.
I think these are also, he has innocent lives under his care and urgent actions he must take.
Mhm.
So he's sort of, the ends justify the means, but his ends are not blowing up a planet or a ship, but it's like, all right, I'm going to nudge this person's mind. I'm not going to cut them down with a lightsaber. So
Very much like Luke, I'm going to temporarily choke you to get you out of my way and intimidate you.
I'm not going to cut both Gamorreans down with my lightsaber to make
Yeah.
a point. So
it's enacting again in these behaviors that are darker, but not to the point of I was going to say personally intimidate, but that's exactly what Luke is trying to do. They're all doing it for the sake of others, or the sake of that conception of, okay, what I'm doing is morally right.
yeah,
I don't think Palpatine thinks that what he's doing is morally right. I think he is relishing in the fact that he is subjugating others.
that appears to be a dark side trait, is acknowledging that the dark side exists and kind of reveling in the power it provides,
Mhm.
and sort of seeing, oh, by being in the dark side, I have transcended morality. Whereas I don't think Qui-Gon is always measuring himself against sort of a moral code at the same time. So while I see Qui-Gon Jinn grappling with the tenets of the Jedi Order, I do not really see him as a Gray Jedi.
Mhm.
Again, he in a different time, maybe he would have been a way seeker or just been allowed to have his different views, but he was born in a more dogmatic time.
Mhm.
So, but he has the option to leave the Jedi Order and considers it. His master even leaves and invites him to leave as well, and he stays.
Mhm.
The Jedi Council invites him to join the Jedi Council, and he rejects that offer. Well, partially then because of the actions he continues to take of ignoring the Jedi Council when he thinks that their orders are incorrect,
Mhm.
which I think is independent-minded. And could that lead to bad decisions? Yes, but I don't think they're ever coming from a place of expedience or personal power, which is what the dark side is. It's coming from a place of disagreement with the tenets of the monastic order that
Hmm.
Qui-Gon Jinn finds himself in, and he makes the conscious decision to stay and attempt to effect change from within. But to the degree that he's willing to entirely violate one of their principles, if he must, to take his own ends.
Hmm.
And he is respected and has the power that there's not, the Jedi Council couldn't really stop him if they wanted to, barring physical confrontation,
Hmm.
which
Or
is
uh, what's the word? Banishment from the order.
which would have been a very extreme step. The Jedi have very rarely banished someone.
Hmm.
So, so yeah, I would not say
Hmm.
Qui-Gon is a great Jedi. I would simply say he is a maverick that disagrees with the tenets of the Order. But as far as his relationship with the Force,
Hmm.
despite him seeing it in a unique way, he's powerful, committed to the light side, and despite having a viewpoint that lets him, I think he quickly engages. He's more decisive. Like once he decides that a course is morally correct, he engages in it. He doesn't
Hmm.
waffle or get second guess himself, which I think is actually a trait that many high-ranking Jedi show, as they don't feel the need to agonize over their decisions.
Yeah.
Once Yoda decides that the clones have turned on the Jedi, he's like, "All right, they are now all enemy combatants and valid targets for my
Hmm.
lightsaber."
He's been
Um,
around long enough to break any sort of attachment that he might have with them.
yeah, and this is why Ahsoka is again, while a Jedi in name, is part of the Order because she rejects the detachment is to attach to the 501st and
Hmm.
refuses to cut them down. Whereas Yoda, with that level of detachment as part of the Order, is like, okay, the clones were our friends, they're no longer, I must kill them to save more people.
Hmm.
So one is a very cosmically balanced decision, and one is a very personally moral one,
Hmm.
which is the difference between Yoda, a Jedi Master who has that attachment, and Ahsoka who rejects that level of detachment, uh, and is why she stays away from the Order as well.
So, in looking at all of these figures, the Bendu and Father are outliers, but the rest are really in this point of flux from light to dark. Luke's on his way to becoming a Jedi Master. Baylan Skoll's on his way to becoming a dark side user of some kind. The only other figures that I can think of, and this is only with a heavy amount of subjective opinion, would be the Guardians of the Wills, which we know barely anything about in the Star Wars universe. I think there might have been a comic book about the Guardians of the Wills, but just from one media of Rogue One, it appears as though there is a group of Force sensitives who are inactive, and they are on the planet of Jeddah, and aren't really proactive in this whole war that's happening between burgeoning rebellion and galactic empire, and it's only when they're personally intertwined that they enact. But we have someone in the character of Chirrut Imwe, who is Jedi in all things but name, because he's certainly Force sensitive, and he is wise beyond his years, but he doesn't choose to enter conflict until conflict passes him.
Well, and we don't see Chirrut displaying any affection for the tenets of the Jedi Order other than being in touch with the living Force.
Hmm.
And he is probably not Force sensitive to the degree that someone like Kanan Jarrus is. While he's able to tell his surroundings, he is most of the time just as blind as any other person. But he
Hmm.
can sense kyber crystals. I mean, he's able to walk across a battlefield dodging blaster bolts,
Hmm.
and then
Shoot a TIE fighter right out of the sky as it's flying.
yeah.
Um,
So certainly Force sensitive, if not the degree that a
mhm.
Jedi is. But as a Gray Jedi, I mean, he's almost more in like the Bendu style, where he
Mhm.
has put himself in a position where we see in the book The Guardians of the Wills, where he and Baze Malbus are very engaged in protecting their local neighborhood, the children of their local neighborhood.
Mhm.
They provide money to an orphanage. They um, only hesitantly work with Saw Gerrera to get supplies for people they need to protect.
Mhm.
And then when Saw Gerrera turns on them to engage in a juicy military target rather than save a bunch of school children, they quickly abandon Saw's cause. So I don't think we really see Chirrut engaging in a morally questionable behavior,
Mhm.
simply that he is outside the bounds of the Jedi Order, a force sensitive individual.
Mhm.
Uh, yeah, and again, we don't. No one questions whether Chirrut shooting a TIE fighter out of the air or beating a bunch of people to death with his staff
Mhm.
is a morally questionable act. These were oppressive soldiers as part of a evil regime.
Yeah, and the way that he deals with stormtroopers, he's not dismembering or killing stormtroopers. He is merely beating them with a stick. Uh,
Well, and later
Yeah,
shooting them with an energy bow.
right. Uh, but again, this is only me conjuring this. If I had to envision what a Gray Jedi Order would be, it would be more akin to the Guardians of the Whills, where they're very localized in their concern. They are not Jedi, seeking out uh, matters to try to bring to peace. They're not being called to action. They are merely acting in their community. Um,
So I think we
yeah.
can see that the only, and this brings us full circle back to the Bendu, is the only way you could try to attempt true neutrality in the Force is if you absent yourself from the complex concerns of a living sentient society.
Mhm.
Being present in that forces more darkness and more light upon you, and does not allow you to contemplate the contemplative detachment necessary. Only sort of withdrawal from complex society allows that kind of neutrality to exist. If you are present in society as a whole, you must grapple then with the daily darkness and base urges and murder and complex greed of society. And if you're a force user, either fall to that darkness or reject it.
Mhm.
And if you're trying to be able to take in all of it and be able to do what you want, then a force user can't be part of such a complex society.
Mhm. So yeah, someone who's more isolationist, who is a little bit more individualistic in what their viewpoint is. These are the things that would be interesting to see, that I would like to see. But Star Wars is very much a story of polar opposites and just the dichotomy of sides of your dyads, your dual nature. So I think that's why it has been hard to even uh, in invent a character of a gray Jedi. Maybe we'll get to see one. Uh, but yeah, that idea of not necessarily taking an approach like the Watcher, where it's I must observe but not interfere. A gray Jedi would more so be, you know, well, trying to attack the issue without the sense of right and wrong, but just a sense of action reaction.
The Jedi acknowledged that retreating from the galaxy was one way to both avoid the temptations of the dark side as well. They had a whole vow called the Barash vow, where a Jedi would retreat from the Jedi Order and be forbade from interacting with the Jedi Order or outside forces in any way until their vow was complete. So we see a couple of people, such as Master Infala, who Darth Vader murders, and some others during the High Republic period, take the Barash vow when they have been tempted by the dark side. It is one of the most stringent vows a Jedi can take, aside from full exile from the Order. But again, we see this tying into our idea that retreat from the world, a complex world, is necessary for a Force user to truly uh, be in a position where they don't have to grapple with such complex questions on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. And it's what, you know, Obi-Wan and Yoda and Luke all eventually do. They recognize their failings and they have to go through these periods of introspection where they heal and then can offer their strength from there. So,
I, I still wonder if there's a galactic real estate agent who specializes in distant, far off, isolated planets for retired and disgraced Jedi Masters.
I I mean that's very well where the next new Jedi Order movie with Rey could go. I mean, she is certainly someone who has heavy influence of light and dark. All she needs is her own planet to separate herself on, and a few students, and we could get a Gray Jedi Order. But I think that in the nature of our conversation, I think we shed light on how difficult it is to try to maintain any sort of balance without having it, still be within the bounds of the light or tipping into the areas of dark.
Right, well, that has been our rumination on the concept of the Gray Jedi. Ultimately, how I see them as those individuals as people in the process of changing. It is not a static state that someone can healthily reach. And often, those who see themselves as Gray Jedi are just in the process of falling to the dark side. Uh,
I'm a bit more in the like moderate case where I think that someone who is a Jedi can exhibit darker traits but still find ways, whether like personally justify them or to justify them within the sort of bounds of what it means to be a Jedi. Unless they decide to do something awesome with the Guardians of the Wills, which I would absolutely love to see, because who doesn't love Donnie Yen?
Well, thank you for listening today. Join us next week for more Star Wars, and we will talk to you too.
We'll see you sometime soon in a galaxy right here.